Zech the Shabbos Perik Yud Zayin Mishnah Aleph. Kol Kalim Nitalim b'Shabbos. All kalim that have doors, even portable closets and dressers and cabinets, may be moved on Shabbos. But also say Niman Ava Pisha and Sparku b'Shabbos. And even if the doors became detached, they may be moved together with the kalim on Shabbos, since the doors will presumably be reattached after Shabbos. The doors do not lose the status as part of the keli and thus are not muktzah. If the door became detached from the keli on Shabbos, it's certainly not muktzah because it was attached when Shabbos began. As a rule, the question of whether an item is muktzah on a particular Shabbos is determined by its muktzah status at the beginning of Shabbos. Even if the door became detached before Shabbos, it's still mutter. Since it will eventually be reattached to the keli, we continue to view it as part of the keli. One may move the door even on its own without the keli. The Mishnah says with the keli to allude to the reason why the door is not muktzah, because it's still part of the keli. She'ein doimin l'dalseis habayis. They're different from the doors of the houses, which are muktzah l'fi she'enim nemuchan, because the doors of the house are not prepared to be moved. That is, the doors of a house are not meant to be taken from one place to another. As such, if they become detached from the house, they're muktzah and they may not be moved at all. The doors of kalim, by contrast, are meant to be moved and removed, for they are attached to a movable keli. Therefore, even if they become detached, which, as explained before, doesn't cause them to lose their status as part of the kalim, they are not muktzah. Mishnah Beis. Neidel Adam Kornitz Lefatzeh Bayis HaGoyzim. An object or an item that's used mainly for activities that are also on Shabbos, like a hammer or a saw, is muktzah under the category of Klisha Malachta L'Isser, a keli whose work is forbidden. However, unlike other muktzah objects which may not be moved at all, items belonging in this category may be moved for certain purposes. One may move them in order to use them for an activity that is mutter on Shabbos, or because one needs it for the space that it's occupying, l'tzarech gufay or l'tzarech mekaymer. One may not move them for their own protection. For example, to take them out of the sun into the shade, mechama l'tzeil, or to safeguard them from getting stolen. The Mishnah will give examples of using items of this category for a davar hamuter. So, Neidel Adam Kornitz Lefatzeh Bayis HaGoyzim, a person may take a hammer to crack nuts, for kardam lachtech hasadvela, or an axe to cut round cakes of pressed figs, meger ligor Bayis HaGvina, a saw to slice thick cheese, magreif a ligref Bayis HaGregris, a shovel to scoop out dried figs from the bottom of a barrel, es harachas v'esamazlig losses a love lakotan, a winnowing shovel or a pitchfork to put food on it for a child. For example, if a child's on the far side of a stream that he cannot cross, in order to pass food to him, one puts the food on a winnowing shovel or at the end of a pitchfork and extends it over the stream. I guess just to make jokes and be silly across the table is probably not mutter. We hear there's real tzarech for that. Es hakush v'es hakarkar litchev, by a spindle, which is a stick that's narrow at one end and wide at the other end, that's used for spinning thread, or a weaver's pick, which we mentioned earlier in Parak Zayin, that a pointed tool was used to separate and straighten the warp threads in the weaving process, which is forbidden because of mesach, which is warping, which is a process in the weaving. So, a kush and a karkar litchayv by, a spindle or a weaver's pick to pierce fruit that's on a plate in order to pick up the fruit, or machat shal yad litel by sakait, or a hand needle, a standard needle used for sewing clothing to remove a splinter in one's skin, v'shal sakam liftach by sadelas, or sack maker's needle, which was a long, thick needle used to sew up sacks to open the door by picking its lock. Although all of these items are muktzah because their main use is also, one may move them on Shabbos for something that is mutter. Mishnah Gimel, Kana shel zaysim. After olives are harvested, they're stored in a vat where they're left to soften before being pressed. A hollow wooden cane is used to turn over the olives in the vat to check whether they're ready for pressing. The Mishnah discusses the halacha of such a cane in regard to tumah and muktzah. So you have a kana shel zaysim, which is a hollow wooden cane that's used for checking olives. Im yesh kesher b'reisha mekabel tumah. There's a knot at its end which prevents the oil inside its hollow from dripping out. Bamboo canes and the like are divided into several sections along the length with a knot at each joint between one section and the next. The cane is hollow, meaning that bump in the bamboo shoot, that's the kesher that we're talking about over here. The cane is hollow apart from the knots. If the length of a cane in which there's a knot is used to turn over the olives, the knot will prevent any oil caught in the cane from dripping out. The oil in the cane can then be examined by determining whether the oil is ready for pressing. So, im yesh kesher b'reisha mekabel tumah. If there's a knot at its end which prevents the oil from dripping out, it's mekabel tumah, because a wooden object that can serve as a container is a keli, and it's going to be good enough to be mekabel tumah. But if it doesn't have a knot at the end, and it cannot hold oil in the hollow part of the cane, so it's not considered a utensil and cannot be tameh. It's going to be considered pshute kli'etz, and it's not going to be mekabel tumah. Benkach or benkach nitel b'Shabbos. In either case, it may be moved on Shabbos, because as far as hilchos muktzah are concerned, it's a keli regardless of whether or not it has a knot. The fact is that the cane is a utensil since it's intended to be used to turn over olives. In regard to hilchos muktzah, there's no requirement that a wooden utensil can be capable of holding things. That's specific to hilchos tumah, kabbalas tumah. So the cane is therefore not muktzah even if it lacks a knot at its end. Mishnah Daled. Rabbi Yosi says, "Kol kalim nitalim," all utensils, all kalim, even those whose main use is forbidden, even a klisha malachta le'isra may be moved on Shabbos for a permitted use, as we mentioned in the Mishnah Beis. Chutz min hamasar hagadol yaset shel machresha, except for a large saw that's used to cut wooden beams, and a large yaset shel machresha is a coulter. It's a large knife-like tool that's attached to a plow and cuts into the ground ahead of the plow. So a utensil of this type may not be moved at all, even for a davar hamotar, because its owner is particular to use it only for its primary purpose, which is asur. So this is going to be muktzah ma'achmas chisarin kis, which includes articles whose owner does not allow them to be used for anything other than the main purpose, because he's afraid that it will be damaged and it will suffer a substantial loss. Kol ha'kelim nitalim l'tzarech v'shalei l'tzarech, as was mentioned earlier. In Mishnah Beis, that one may move a utensil whose main use is forbidden, klisha malachta le'isr, l'tzarech gufay mekaymer, for the sake of a permitted activity, or because one needs to use the space it occupies. One may not move it for its own protection, like mechama l'tzeil, or to protect it from getting stolen. Here the Mishnah is going to discuss the use of utensils whose main use is mutter. Kol ha'kelim nitalim l'tzarech v'shalei l'tzarech, all utensils whose main use is mutter, it may be moved whether for a purpose, to use them to clear the place they occupy, or not for a purpose, for no purpose except their own protection. Even utensils whose main use is permitted may not be moved except for a purpose, specifically the purpose for which they are intended. For example, a knife may be moved only to cut and not to support an unbalanced plate. Mishnah Hey. Kol ha'kelim anitalim b'Shabbos shavreim nitalim imohen levad sheyiyu oisen me'ein malacha. The Mishnah discusses the halacha of a keli that broke either before or on Shabbos. So, kol ha'kelim anitalim b'Shabbos shavrein nitalim. Any utensils that may be moved on Shabbos, if the pieces broke off of it, they can also be moved. Imahen l'chayr, they take out of the girsa. Uvad sheyu oisen me'ein malacha, provided that it can still perform some sort of function, even if it's completely different from the utensil's original function. For example, if you have pieces of a broken mixing bowl that are fit to cover the opening of a barrel, or broken shards of glass from a glass container that are fit to cover the opening of a jar. Since these pieces are usable for something, they're still considered a utensil and are not muktzah. Pieces that are useless, however, are indeed muktzah. Rabbi Yehuda says, pieces of a utensil that broke on Shabbos may be moved only if they can perform something like their original function. For example, a piece of a broken mixing bowl must be fit to pour porridge into them. And pieces of broken glass container must be fit to pour oil into them to be used as a container. A mixing bowl is used for kneading dough, therefore its pieces must be able to hold a thick dough-like substance, like porridge. That piece of a glass container which is used to hold liquids must be fit to contain oil or other liquids. In cases like this, the pieces are not muktzah. However, if they cannot be used for anything resembling the keli's original function, but only for an entirely new function, they're like a newly formed keli, and as such they're muktzah because of nailad, which is something that's created on Shabbos. The category of nailad includes items that did not exist or were not usable when Shabbos began. If a utensil broke on Shabbos and its pieces cannot be used anything that resembles the utensil's purpose, they are like new kelim that didn't exist before Shabbos, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that they are also because of nailad. Mishnah Vav. Ha'evan shalakiruya. The Mishnah discusses a halacha where a stone or a branch, which is generally muktzah, is attached to a non-muktzah object. The first case involves a pumpkin shell that's used as a bucket. In order to make the shell capable of drawing water from the well, a stone is attached to it to weigh it down, because otherwise the shell will float and not sink into the water. So, ha'evan shalakiruya, the halacha about a stone that's inside a pumpkin shell, if you can draw water from the shell without the stone falling out, which shows that the stone is securely attached on the bottom of this pumpkin. Memalaba, we may draw water with it, and we may use the shell together with the stone to draw water on Shabbos. Since the stone is securely attached, it's regarded as part of the bucket, and the stone is not muktzah v'im lav. But if we're not able to use the shell to draw water without the stone falling out, ein memalaba, we may not draw water with it. In this case, where the stone is not securely attached to the bucket, it's not considered part of the bucket. The stone is therefore muktzah, like stones in general. Since the stone is muktzah, the bucket also becomes muktzah, because it's a basis l'davar ha'aser. The category of basis l'davar ha'aser consists of items that are not muktzah, but are used to hold or support items that are muktzah. For example, a bed which money was placed. The base supporting the forbidden object is considered muktzah itself. In Amrish's case, the bucket is the base of the stone. Therefore, if the stone is muktzah, so is the bucket. If a branch is tied to a pitcher so that one can use it as a rope to lower the pitcher into a well, we may draw water with the pitcher on Shabbos. That is, we may use the pitcher together with the branch to draw water on Shabbos. Here too, the branch is not muktzah because it's considered part of the pitcher and it's not going to be osir. Mishnah Zayin. Pekak hachaloin. The halacha of a window shutter. The raisa of baina, the malacha the raisa of baina entails not only building a permanent structure from scratch, but also making a permanent addition to an existing structure. For example, adding a door. As a safeguard against the malacha the raisa, the chachamim asked building even a temporary structure from scratch. The Mishnah discusses whether the chachamim also asked to make a temporary addition to an existing structure. The specific case in this Mishnah is that you have a case of a window shutter, which is a plank of wood or a curtain, which is not muktzah. It's used to block a window temporarily. So, the law of a window shutter, Rebbe says, if it's tied to the building and the rope is so short that the shutter is suspended in the air when not in use, you may use it to block the window on Shabbos. Since the shutter is tied and suspended, it already appears to be part of the main structure, and putting it into the window does not resemble the malacha of building. But if it's not tied and suspended, we may not block the window with it. Since one must lift it from the ground to use it to block the window, he appears to be adding something new to the building. According to Rebbe, the Chachamim answered even making a binyan arai, a temporary addition to an existing structure. Therefore, one may not use a shutter to temporarily block a window unless it already appears to be part of the building. The Chachamim say benkach or benkach. Paika can buy in either case whether the shutter is tied and suspended or not tied at all. We may block the window within a Shabbos because, according to the Chacham, it's mutter to make a temporary addition to an existing structure, even if the shutter is completely detached from the structure and using it resembles building. One may shutter the window within a Shabbos because the Chacham did not ask making a temporary addition to a permanent structure. Mishnah Ches Kol Kisuya Hakelim Sheish Lameis Achizin Litalim B'Shabbos. Midrabanan, it's also for one to replace the cover of a hole in the ground, like a pit or a well, because he appears to be making a permanent addition to the ground, which would be the malacha deraisa of baina. Likewise, one may not remove such a cover because he seems to be demolishing a permanent structure, which is also because of seiser. If the cover has a handle, however, replacing or removing it is mutter, because the handle shows that the cover is not intended to be part of the ground, but it's just a utensil that covers a hole in the ground. The Mishnah discusses whether the cover of a keli that's attached to the ground, such as a stove or an oven, is treated in this regard like the cover of a hole in the ground. So, all covers of kelim that are attached to the ground may be moved on Shabbos if they have handles. If the cover has a handle, it's clearly meant to be removed and replaced. So using the cover does not resemble the malacha deraisa of building or seiser. But if the cover does not have a handle, one may not use it, just as one may not use such a cover to close or open a hole in the ground. Rabbi Yossi argues and he says, in what case are we talking about? In what case are we mechalik between a cover with a handle and a cover without a handle? In regard to covers of holes in the ground, we're using a cover that lacks a handle, indeed resembles the malacha of baina. However, in regard to covers of kelim that are attached to the ground, in either case, whether they have handles or not, they may be moved on Shabbos. So Rezi argues that a keli attached to the ground is not considered like a hole in the ground, but it's like a movable keli. It's like metaltalin. The regular metal kelim that are metaltalin. Therefore, covering it is the same as covering a movable keli, which is certainly mutter, even if the cover does not have handles. Allah is like the chacham sham, that anything that's attached to the ground, it's like the ground itself. as we explained previously.